Nation, we welcome you here. A couple housekeeping items. If you need to use the restroom, there's restrooms behind this wall. If you go through the exit there, you'll see the exit. You can find bathrooms there, or on the other side in the hallway if you came in from the door from the parking lot. Temple Micah shares this space with us, and they are worshiping right now in the meeting house, so we're just aware of that. When we exit, they're also having a celebration tonight, and there'll likely be a ice truck out in the parking lot, so just be aware of that. At this time, I'd ask you to silence your phones or put them on vibrate, please. And I invite you on your seat, you would have seen this slip of paper. You're welcome to use the camera icon on your phone to scan it. When you put your phone on the camera, when you put it on this QR code, this square, it'll pull up to a spreadsheet where you can sign up to get announcements. There is also a paper copy there on the table, so you're welcome to do that. Also on the table, you will see copies of the Lawrence resolution, if you're interested in looking at that on reparations, and the New Jersey Reparations Task Force bill. At this moment, I would like to invite Nicole Plett, who is the co-chair of the League of Women Voters, to come on up.
I'm sure. Oh, okay. Thank you. So, thank you so much all for being here. This is great. My name is Nicole Plett, and I've been asked to tell you why we are gathering tonight. As Elizabeth told you, I'm co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Lawrence Township. The League of Women Voters encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government. Our current League slogan is "Making Democracy Work." And in that vein, we are gathered here tonight for a community conversation about the New Jersey Reparations Task Force bill, a plan to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans over a 2-year period. I want to thank you especially for joining us tonight to help us advance our request to the Lawrence Town Council to help make democracy work by passing a resolution in support of this stalled legislation. We are not asking our town to study reparations. Rather, we are asking the town council to help us make our voices heard in the state legislature. Here is why we need your help. A year ago, a letter was sent to then President Sweeney and Speaker Coughlin asking for passage of the task force bill, a letter signed by 105 New Jersey organizations representing many, many concerned citizens. Yet a year has passed and the bill has still not been scheduled for any committee hearings. It's for this reason that advocates have turned to local resolutions to bring pressure on our legislators to do the right thing. As of today, 10 county and municipal bodies have passed such resolutions. Here in Lawrence, many community organizations and individuals have been working together in coalition toward the eventual passage of a Lawrence resolution. And I would like to now ask all those who have been volunteering their time and working with this coalition to please stand and receive our thanks. So, yes. Thank you. Education is at the core of the League of Women Voters mission, and understanding our state's huge racial wealth gap means learning about New Jersey's deep ties to the institution of slavery and the systemic racism that is its legacy. Thank you again for joining this conversation, and it is now my pleasure to introduce the Reverend William Bill Howard of Lawrence Township.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Lawrence Township resident since 1979, and it's my great pleasure to be associated with this effort. I'm meeting a lot of outstanding citizens of this township for the first time. Fred Vereen and I go back just under 100 years. But a half century, indeed. Prior to retiring in 2015, I pastored a congregation in Newark. And one of the great pleasures I had in that town was to get to know the work of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And our speaker tonight is the chief executive of that organization, and it's my task to present him to you. But before I do that, let me just say, we're not paying him to be here. So I told him, and you know, that's foreign to a Baptist preacher, which I am. But I said to him, allow me please to introduce to those who don't know the Institute something about the organization. So we have some excellent material here on the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I hope you will take a copy or two of these, and let's become a Lawrence Township group of supporters of this outstanding organization. Now, Ryan Haygood hails from the great state of Colorado, and he is a graduate of Colorado College and the University of Colorado Law School. His background is in civil litigation at the state and federal level, and he came over to New Jersey from the world-renowned NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where he is still much admired, and I fear almost daily that they're going to steal him back from us. But the Institute has led the campaign. As Nicole has said, we have a bill in both houses in Trenton that really have gone virtually nowhere. And now 10 jurisdictions have expressed themselves in support of these resolutions, and we want to be at least number 11. That's all we're asking. And Ryan is going to come and tell us, because the Institute is leading this campaign, it is because of an appeal from him that we became involved in this. So how delighted I am that he's joining us this evening to talk about the Reparations Task Force, what its aims are, and we're going to have an opportunity to ask good questions when he is done speaking. So again, thank you very much. On behalf of those who've worked so hard to make this moment possible, I bring you Ryan Haygood.
Good evening. Good evening. It's so good to be here. You all stole a legend from us in the city of Newark and the mighty Pastor Howard. And it really is an honor to be here to talk to you about work that he really inspired around reparations. Pastor Howard mentioned that I came to Jersey by way of Colorado. I was raised there. I met my now wife, then high school sweetheart, Charity, there. And I've been practicing law for 20 years. This is my 20th year as a lawyer. So I've been thinking just a lot about these last 20 years. My first day at work was 9/11. I got married in August 11th in Denver. My wife did a program called Teach for America, which staffed her in Newark. At that time, truth is I didn't think a whole lot about the East Coast. I thought I'd be in Colorado always. I applied for an opportunity to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I got this fellowship where I worked for 2 years at a firm called Fried Frank, and then I spent a bunch of years at the Legal Defense Fund before I came to the Institute. But my first day at work was 9/11. I took the train into the World Trade Center as the first plane hit the first tower, and the conductor of the train told us to get off. And so I got off and I looked up and I just thought somebody was flying too low. First day at work. And then I was leaving a message for my wife, Charity, and I saw the second plane hit the World Trade, the second tower. And I was like, oh gosh, this is intentional. So I left a message for my wife saying, look, this place is bananas. I got to go back to Colorado. Right? So I've been just thinking a lot about that, like 20 years. And I've been really, really blessed, to Pastor Howard's point, to do work that really feeds my soul. And so it's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you to say a word about reparations. What I'd love to do is just talk to you about what sort of inspired this work, sort of why New Jersey has a unique piece of this story, and then what I think we all can do together. So you all are doing this work now, what we can do together to really get New Jersey to finally say the word reparations. So quickly, I'll walk through kind of what situates us in this moment historically. Look, I'm a lawyer by training, so for those of you who are lawyers and who want to, I see some young folks in the back who want to be lawyers. I see someone with a Rider University shirt who wants to be a lawyer, so I want to talk to you more about that. But the way that law school courses are conducted is there's a professor in the front, and he or she often has a seating chart with people's pictures, right? And he'll just start. So it'd be like, I see you with the Rider shirt, and then it's just you and the professor all class. It's called the Socratic method. But I don't want to do that. But if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to raise them. And to Pastor Howard's point, I brought some materials. Feel free to take those with you on the chair there. And so this is an image that I think a lot about. This sort of organizes the way we think about the work we do at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We're a racial justice organization. Our advocacy is powered by community organizers, by professors, and by lawyers. And we think a lot about how all of us are like this young black boy in this picture. We're all standing on a foundation, right? And the foundation is cracked by structural racism. And in particular, in the last couple of years, as we've weathered the COVID-19 pandemic, as we weathered the police brutality pandemic, the broader structural racism pandemic, we've seen those cracks explode as earthquakes in black communities and other communities of color. And the thing is this, we all know we didn't create that foundation. In fact, we inherited it. But the question for us is, as people of conscience, as people of faith, what do we do? How do we take responsibility for repairing the cracks in the foundation that we did not cause? I'm 46 years old, and I've thought a lot about how this is a conversation we've been having over generations. This is a really powerful image that was the cover of the New Yorker magazine back in June of 2020. It's the outline of George Floyd, and what I found most striking about this image is kind of a snapshot of black people's existence in this country. At the very bottom of the image is a picture of enslaved black folks as we came to this country. But in the very center here is a picture of a white car, right? That car then was the Hyundai. Folks might remember the Hyundai. This was March 3rd, 1991 in Los Angeles, California. And there's a man on the ground surrounded by what amount to be 4 Los Angeles police officers. And you all know this scene, March 3rd, 1991, Los Angeles. That man is Rodney King. Right. And you remember that at that time, we thought if you could just capture police brutality on camera, and this was an important moment because the camcorder back, remember the large thing on the shoulder, right? Captured 4 Los Angeles police officers brutalizing Rodney King, hitting him between 56 and 59 times about the head and shoulders on camera. And so we thought, now we have an opportunity to realize the brutality visited upon this defenseless man as captured by video. This should be a moment for police accountability. That was 30 years ago, and we're still having conversations about the ways that our foundation is cracked by structural racism, by police brutality. You'll remember that those 4 police officers were each acquitted on all state charges. It took federal civil rights charges finally to convict 2 of those 4 police officers. And here is a really striking image my colleague at the Institute, Jake, created. We spend a bunch of time looking at racial disparities in our work. We think a lot about how important data is to understand how racism shows up here in New Jersey and more broadly. And so this is a staircase of some of New Jersey's racial disparities as they apply to Black folks. And I think a lot about how the staircase is sort of an interesting metaphor for life, right? That each of us confront challenges represented here by stairs, and it really is on us to think about how you both confront and overcome those challenges. But for Black people by the numbers in New Jersey, the staircase is especially steep. And I just want to lift up 2 specific to the same young Black boy we saw on the previous slide. The first one is in the second stair, which looks at the individual net wealth of people in New Jersey by race. So for white adults, white individual adults, the individual net wealth is $103,000, right? Individual net wealth, white adults, $103,000. But by contrast, the individual net wealth for Black individuals is $4,900. $103,000 to $4,900. If you go down one step, you look at the individual net wealth of families. For white families in New Jersey, it's $322,000. That's among the highest net wealth of any family in the country, versus just $17,700 for Black families. I'm going to talk to you about where that individual and familial net wealth gap comes from. Some folks, that's not a gap. That's a different universe, right? And then if you go up 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, 5 steps to the 18-to-1 disparity, you'll see that is, and that was hard to read from where you are. You can tell that a lawyer made that with all the text on the stairs. But the 18-to-1 racial disparity reflects the Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in New Jersey. That's the highest in the country. And put differently, a Black child in New Jersey is 18 times more likely to be imprisoned than a white child, even though Black and white kids, Black and white adults commit most offenses at about the same rate. And in our state, a state of more than 9 million people, according to the 2020 census, there are 11 white kids in prison. Now, I'm not advocating for the deeper incarceration of white kids, but that low number doesn't reflect actual participation in crime by white kids. What it reflects is a vastly different response to white kids when white kids do things that may entangle them in the criminal justice system. So we've got the worst racial disparities in youth and in adult incarceration in the country. And our investment, our financial investment in incarceration, particularly youth incarceration, is staggering. In this year's budget, New Jersey is investing more than $600,000 to incarcerate each young person. Per kid, an annual expenditure of better than $600,000. And for those of you who are school teachers or social workers who work with kids, imagine what you could do with an annual investment in the kids you work with at $600,000 per kid. I mentioned to you my wife, her name is Charity. She is here in the foreground of this picture. She's a principal of a district school called Avon Avenue School in Newark, New Jersey. She's been the principal there for better than 10 years. And in this picture, she's surrounded by her team at the school. And you'll see that on the left side of the picture, there are boxes on the floor. Those are boxes that contain 125 computers. And it was in this photo at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020 that Charity and her team were working to distribute all the computers they had in their school to get to their students so they could learn online at home. And they were 125 computers short of each kid getting a device on which to learn online at home. And this gentleman named Michael Rowe, who hosts a syndicated show called Returning the Favor, learned about the shortage and about charity's effort and her team's effort to distribute computers. And in an incredible act of generosity, Michael Rowe gifted Avon Avenue School $25,000, with which she purchased 125 computers. And then right after this photo, she and her team distributed those computers to each of the children in the school, really get each of the scholars in school. Really an incredible act of generosity, real heroism for Michael Rowe, and then heroism from Charity and her team to put themselves in harm's way in the throes of a pandemic to deliver computers to kids at home. And these are two of Charity's students. Now, for the educators, right, and those who work with young people, particularly kids who face steep stairs, steep challenges, you know the importance of channeling hope and optimism in the work that you do, being able to see the possibilities even when the naked eye sees real challenges. And so if my wife were here, she would tell you that you can, to the extent you can see the photo based on where you are in the room, you see a lot of things that grieve your spirit, that hurt your heart about the way in which these kids are learning at home in March of 2020. But what my wife would want you to focus on is the ingenuity of these two boys. One of the major challenges, you all remember this, we learned early in the pandemic is that you could get kids computers in their homes, but if they did not have access to they couldn't log on. And so what these boys did was they moved their computers, again, in an act of real ingenuity, to the windowsill, which they made their desks, and they borrowed Wi-Fi from a neighbor who had it, right? So my wife would talk a lot about what you can take from the way in which these boys fashion for themselves ways to learn at home, even in the face of obvious challenges. But what my wife would also say is that individual acts of heroism, Michael Rowe, $25,000 to Avon Avenue School, Charity purchasing 125 computers, she and her team distributing them to the scholars in their school. That individual acts of heroism are not replacements for broken systems. That individual acts of heroism cannot fill in those cracks in our foundation that were designed that way. And what grieves me most about, I think, these last 2 years, we spent a lot of time talking about, appropriately, the harm visited upon George Floyd, many others who were victims of police brutality. That frame is very much a harm reduction frame, which is to say, how do we cause the harm to stop? It's a very defensive posture, but what I am attracted to in the reparations conversation is that it requires us to imagine, but how can people, and Black people in particular, how can we win? So it's not just stop harm, but how do we repair harm, and how do we create a reality in which kids don't have to learn in this way. Shortly after this photo was taken, I sent a tweet about the way in which, in my mind, in the real way, New Jersey embodies the two Americas that Dr. King talked about more than 50 years ago. And I lift up this number that in white New Jersey, the median household wealth is more than $300,000. In Black New Jersey, it's $17,700. And I say that is by design. I say, think about that. A $300,000 plus racial wealth gap. Well, Ryan, why are we talking about that? Where does that come from? This is an image of New Jersey, and no disrespect to native New Jerseyans, because I've had this conversation with a lot of folks, not you all, less conscious people outside of this building, about New Jersey and about this image. Ryan, you just showed us an image of New Jersey outlined in the Confederate flag, which is entirely inconsistent with how I understand the history to have occurred in New Jersey. And then that leads us to the next slide, that very often not you all, but other New Jerseyans outside of this room don't appreciate that slavery happened very, very deeply here. In fact, it happened in our most formative years as a colony. And then New Jersey has some of the largest ports into which enslaved Africans and later enslaved black folks came. This is one of the ports in Camden, at Cooper Street, but they exist in other places, in Perth Amboy and more. And this is an article, a fascinating article called Slavery's Legacy is written all over North Jersey, if you know where to look. And in this article, the author calls New Jersey a place that was known as the slave state of the North. I live in Newark, as Pastor Howard mentioned. I found this ad from some of our friends at Rutgers University in Newark. It's an ad that seeks to have a runaway enslaved black person whom they call Will, who's 49, a few years older than me, return to his enslaver for the total of $20. This was Newark, New Jersey, February 8, 1802. We wrote this report, which I brought here for you all, called Erasing New Jersey's Red Lines. And it talks about where our racial wealth gap today came from. And so the premise of the report says that from our founding as a colony, we, New Jersey, created a racially exclusive system for distributing property. And that, at our founding, the way we created the racial wealth gap in slavery is what has created the racial wealth gap we have today. Well, Ryan, that was a long time ago. So here's the thing. So New Jersey provided, at our founding as a colony, provided each English white settling family with 150 acres of land. Each English white settling family, as a way to incentivize those families that come to this colony, gave them each 150 acres of land to get started, and an additional 150 acres of land for each enslaved black person who worked on that land, as an incentive to come to New Jersey at our This is where our racial wealth gap was created, at our founding, at the giving of land and the incentivizing of additional parcels of land for the ownership of black folks who worked on that land. Such that by the by the 1800s, more than 2/3 of all enslaved black people in the North were held captive right here in New Jersey. And after becoming the last northern state to finally end formal slavery, we created our own form of sharecropping. We had another word, we called it cottaging, synonymous with sharecropping, that when slavery finally ended for black people, black folks still worked on that land, now under cottaging. So very often here I get, well, Ryan, like that was several hundred years ago. What's the relationship of that? Even if we give you that the racial wealth gap was conceived of, was created, started in slavery when New Jersey was a colony, what's the relationship to 2022? And here's the thing, that there's a direct line from our founding as a state that held black people captive to today's racial wealth gap. There is an unbroken line from slavery, then to sharecropping, which we call cottaging, then to the use of restrictive covenants that determined where black people could and could not live, then to denial of homeownership opportunities through the GI Bill for black World War II veterans, then to Jim Crow segregation in the North, here in New Jersey, then to redlining whole cities created by red lines, including cities like Newark, Camden, Trenton, parts of Plainfield, then exclusionary zoning policies, predatory lending practices to today's racial wealth gap. There is an unbroken line from the creation of the racial wealth gap in slavery in New Jersey to today's racial wealth gap. I was having a conversation with some folks right before COVID on the college campus on this issue, talking about the racial wealth gap. And there was a gentleman in his 50s, white gentleman, right in the front. I could see he was very unsettled by this, right? One of the things they teach you in law school, Rider University, is that one of the first lessons is that you learn your audience, right? You're always mindful of who you're talking to, and you're aware of how they react. Because your audience very often are judges, right? You don't want to lose the judges because you need them to vote for you, or a jury. So I could tell this gentleman was unsettled, and I knew he would have questions, and I knew he was anxious for me to stop talking so he could get to his questions. So I finished, his hand shot up, I went straight to him. And he said, okay, so the racial wealth gap, those numbers, like, where are those? So what he's saying is, are those numbers reliable? Are those sources credible? So I'm glad you asked. So in our most recent report, Redesigning the Line, you'll find the sources in footnotes 27 and 28. Some of which come from Prosperity Now, a reputable national organization, some of our individual research and writing at the Institute. Okay. So then so now he credits the numbers. So then comes the second argument. Well, the reason why the net wealth for Black people is so low, and now comes the personal responsibility narrative. And he said some version, there was an audience too, a lot of people. And he said boldly, the reason why the individual or family net wealth of Black folks is so low is because of something wrong with you all. You're prodigal with finances when you work. This is a true story. You don't work as hard when you work. Higher incidences of unemployment, prodigal with finances, don't save well. If you did something differently, Black people, you could erase that racial wealth gap. Here's the thing, at the national level, it would take Black families at the national level, and that national racial wealth gap is much smaller than New Jersey's. It would take Black families 228 years to catch up to where white folks are today. Put differently, there's no amount of personal responsibility. The hardest working, best saving Black family cannot close that racial wealth gap because it was designed that way from the top to advantage some folks and disadvantage others. So he said that, but then the final thing he said was fascinating. Again, in the audience is present. He said, and by the way, I'm a white man, clearly I can see that. He said, and I don't have an individual net wealth of $103,000. And I couldn't resist you all. I said, well, that, my friend, that is a personal failure, right? Because there's been no systematic effort to separate you or deprive you from land, which is the primary driver of wealth. So Ryan, that's a lot. It just feels heavy. Oh my gosh, he just marched us through slavery and inequality. And what does one do with all of that? And here I think is the tremendous opportunity we have. I'll say a bit about it and then I open it up to questions. But I just want to say this preliminarily. Last 2 years, we have experienced levels of discomfort, encroachment, loss that has really been unimaginable, right? And I've heard a lot of responses to that, one of which has been, I just want to get back to normal. Like, I just want my life back. I want to resume some normalcy, some of what it was like pre-COVID. And I've wrestled with that because those stairs, those images on the stairs, that was part of New Jersey's normal. I really don't have any interest in returning to normal. And the truth is, like you all, I get kind of tired of having the same conversations over and over. And part of why we keep having the same conversations is because we haven't been willing to have what I think is the real conversation, which is around reparations, right? Which is, how do you actually repair that harm? How do you actually get to the root of that and have the honest conversation about what would be required to repair the harm? And this is part of what I think the way forward is. That when changes happen in this country, it's always happened from the ground up in communities like this, in conversations like these. It's never come directly from Washington, D.C. down. Washington, D.C., when it acts, I'm trying to block out the last several years, but when Washington, D.C. has acted for the good of people, it's always been in response to people organized in their communities. Selma, Alabama, Princeton, New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, Jackson, Mississippi. That has always been the story. That change occurs from the ground up in our communities. And that really is where this conversation has been getting significant traction since we got this bill introduced here in the state capitol. So as Pastor Howard mentioned, we We're really inspired by the George Floyd moment and this idea of really getting to the root of the harm and how we might begin to repair that, or how we might begin to have conversations that would really get to repairing harm. And so we stood in our capital in Trenton with a number of courageous legislators to get this bill introduced. It really goes back to work that Pastor Howard and others have been doing since the 1980s. Then it was about apartheid. There was a conversation then about a very similar bill like this that would finally create a commission that would just do two things, right? One of which is just to have this conversation so we can have a shared understanding of New Jersey's history. It was a slave state, absolutely a slave state. And the reason that matters is because we continue to live in the shadow of, with the vestiges of slavery. And if we divorce the present day reality from our history, all you're left with is what that man courageously shared in front of all those witnesses. That those racial disparities reflect problems with black people in their DNA. Prodigal with finances, can't save, broken homes, don't work hard, not ambitious enough, poor follow through, right? All of the personal failures will attach to the racial disparities if you don't understand where they come from. This task force would take that on. And then the task force would make recommendations, policy and practice recommendations to repair that harm. That's it. And then it would release a report with those recommendations, and that report would be used to get the legislature here to act. And so we met shortly after the bill was introduced with leadership in the legislature, including Speaker Craig Coughlin. Really quickly, in New Jersey, the way that it works, ours is a machine politician state. It just is. It is politics entrenched. Machinery. The way bills move is they have to get the blessing of the leadership on the Assembly side and the Senate side. On the Assembly side is Craig Coughlin. He's the Speaker of the Assembly. No bills moving without his blessing. So we met with him. Speaker Craig Coughlin, we want you to champion in this moment that folks are calling a racial reckoning. We want you to champion this legislation that would create a reparations task force that would look at New Jersey's role in slavery, would define what reparations is, and would make policy and other recommendations to repair the harm. Let's have a conversation like the one we're having. He said to me, Ryan, egads, the word reparations, oh gosh, that's, I mean, you got to think visibly, like uncomfortable. Like that just, oh gosh, reparations, that's like, it unsettles people. You know, the word reparations, when you say it, it's like a curse word. It makes people uncomfortable, Ryan, and it unsettles people. Can't you call it a Black Lives Matter task force? This is an honest conversation. Or a racial wealth gap task force, or an equity task force. Like, can't you find a synonym for the word reparations? If you did that, look, I'd support it today, but I got to pray about that one, Pastor. And that conversation inspired the name of the campaign that we launched. Speaker Craig Coughlin, now Senate President Nick Scutari, Governor Phil Murphy, we need you to say the word reparations. Because here's the thing, we're asking you to create a task force. I mean, that's the shame of tonight's conversation. Ryan, you laid out all that, and the remedy for all of that is that you want to create a task force? Because very often politicians create task forces when they don't want to focus on issues, right? A task force is created when they're like, oh, that's what you want? Oh, listen, you create a task force, some smart people in Princeton, definitely some professors and professionals. They go somewhere and meet for a couple of years, right? You know this is true. They write a report, and the report goes on somebody's bookshelf for posterity, right? So we said, Speaker Craig Coughlin, the concession is that we're asking you for a task force. Having made the concession, we got to at least be clear about what the concession is. So yes, we want it to be called a reparations task force or commission. Last year, almost done, you all, on Juneteenth. This was the first year that New Jersey celebrated Juneteenth as a state holiday. Juneteenth, for those who don't know, it was a day, June 19th, also Juneteenth, 1865, when a General Gordon Granger, he rode horseback into Galveston, Texas. He found about 250,000 black people who thought they were still enslaved. They had actually been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years earlier. It's just that nobody told them. So they kept working as if they were enslaved, though they had been free technically for 2.5 years, and the notices got there late. There's all kind of metaphors in that, right? So General Gordon Granger comes 2 years later on June 19th, now called Juneteenth, to tell them about their freedom. So their celebrations now federally, it's part of a holiday. New Jersey celebrates it as a state holiday. June 19th is a celebration of freedom. Here's the thing though, in the absence of an understanding of the history in New Jersey, you would miss that New Jersey actually rejected the Emancipation Proclamation. That New Jersey was seeking to help southern states in the Confederacy. That New Jersey rejected the Reconstruction Amendment. So we are, as a state, celebrating Juneteenth, having historically rejected the thing that would lead to a celebration. And so the challenge is, absent the history, what we end up doing is celebrating symbolism. You celebrate too soon, as we did last year. But on Juneteenth, we hosted a rally for the Reparations Commission. And we were joined by a number of folks. We have a really strong faith leader group, including folks from Unitarian Universalist Church, bishops, of course, Pastor Howard, rabbis. It's a multi-faith, multi-ethnic group of folks across New Jersey pushing for the Reparations Task Force. One of the signs you hear says, reparations equals repair nation. That's Reverend Anya Samler in Montclair. And then we marched over to City Hall. We had a terrific turnout. Lots of speakers, including our federal delegations, Bonnie Watson Coleman and Congressman Donald Payne. And then we had the Lieutenant Governor, who in her remarks said the conversation has to be about reparations from the Lieutenant Governor. Reverend Anya Samler said in a tweet that I sent, she said, everyone in New Jersey has benefited from or been harmed by slavery. I have benefited. Governor Murphy, you have benefited. Speaker Coughlin, you have benefited. New Jersey, she said, must pass the Reparations Task Force bill now. And I think in the absence of having an honest conversation, it doesn't mean that conversations aren't had. Like if we don't talk about reparations, it does not mean that folks won't have conversations. In fact, I think in the absence of an honest conversation like the one around reparations, you see an even greater assault on the truth, as we've seen with the attack on critical race theory. Or in this Washington Post article about how folks are banning Toni Morrison's books, which the title says that doing that doesn't protect kids, it just sanitizes racism. So finally, one of our faith leader press conferences included a group of folks, including Rabbi Weisberg, who said, we have to repair what was done. As Americans hear from generations or new, this responsibility falls upon all of us. I urge us all to support the New Jersey Reparations Task Force bill. So we created this tool, Phone to Action, which allows folks to interact with their legislators and the governor, 400yearsnj.org, in support of this bill. And the last thing I'll say is we've gone very, very local. So as was mentioned at the top, 10 locations, 2 counties, 8 cities. This week was Jersey City, have passed resolutions. And I think this will be the place where we see great traction in a way that as town councils and city councils, as counties pass resolutions in support of the legislation at the state level, that our state elected officials will begin to take notice in a way that passes the bill so we can finally have a conversation that includes saying the word reparations. And with that, I'll pause. Welcome the opportunity to talk to you all. Sure. Oh, sorry, not, okay, I apologize.
Don't apologize. You don't have to apologize for nothing. My job could be a very difficult job if we didn't have a good speaker. I'm here to thank the speaker. Now, if we didn't have such a speaker as we had, you might be throwing bottles or anything at me. But fortunately, I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
And we hope that this is not the last time you come down. We have a good turnout tonight, and I'm quite sure we get you down here again. It'll be 3 times as many that's here now. And you probably hear this again, but next week, the 17th, at City Council, we want everybody to be there. Bring somebody, because we want you, whoever can get up and speak, we want you to say that you support, and you want them to support this legislation. So write that down. Next council meeting. That's next Tuesday. Okay. Again, and Bill Howard and he said we go back a while. I was here a little longer than Bill. My family moved in Lawrence in 1941. So and I'm still here.
Yeah.
And the issues that we fought in the 60s, we're still fighting. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
That was absolutely phenomenal. My name is Kelly Cleveland. I'm a proud Lawrence resident. I was asked to moderate the Q&A tonight. Is that of service to you?
Yeah, I follow your lead. So it was easy.
We want to make sure that everybody can be heard. So if you want to ask a question, I think we'll repeat the question and then you can go ahead and answer, okay? Who's got Lindsay?
I'll start it out. Brian, you had a smile on my face when you said that the chair of the Senate or whatever said, don't call it reparations, call it something else, right? I laughed because I said, well, I was trying to say, well, I'm trying to create a commission of task force just to have a conversation, but okay, here's a bill that you can put with solutions. Now, so the question I have is, we showed the disparity of all the factors on that staircase, right?
Yeah.
So, do we have a document or something laid out with what are some of the solutions on each of those steps with those disparities?
Sure. So yeah, wonderful question, and I think really practical one is, so we lifted up all these disparities. So what are the solutions? And I will say to you, and so I mentioned the conversation we had with Speaker Craig Coughlin. On the Senate side, we had a conversation with then Senate President Sweeney, and he said some version of this to me. He said, Ryan, you know what? I know what this is about. Reparations, you're going to ask us to write each black person a check for like $1 trillion, right? That's what literally, that's what that is. And I do think that investments are part of repairing harm, but check writing actually underappreciates the gravity of the undertaking, right? Because to really understand the harm, you'd have to look at, so the racial wealth gap was created a long time ago by design. And the primary driver of the racial wealth gap is home ownership. So in New Jersey, less than 40% of black families own their homes. Better than 80% of white families own their homes. And when black families own their homes, very often they're valued at far less than the areas where white families. So even when black people own, I own a beautiful home in Newark, and it's a whole lot less than the homes in Milburn, 8 miles away, that are about 1.1 million on average, right? And so I think to your question, we understand what some of the drivers of the racial wealth gap are, but there are real policy solutions around deepening home ownership. There was even discussion, I read an article about how there's discussion about converting Section 8 vouchers so that people who are in Section 8 housing can begin to own those, right? Like they're like the solutions are there, and part of the charge, I'm not punning your question, because I love the question. Part of the charge of the task force is to bring together the very best minds who are looking at these issues. So there's all manner of scholarship around closing the racial wealth gap. There's all manner of scholarship around reimagining public safety. The reason that we have such a staggering racial disparity in incarceration is because we invest so deeply in incarcerating kids from certain neighborhoods in a way that doesn't advance public safety. Very often we think, oh my gosh, part of the way you create a safer community is deeper policing. I will say to you, I lived in Newark for 20 years. I remember when Cory Booker was the mayor and we had about 1,400 police officers. And then the push was, we need more police officers. There was never a number that we would get to and we felt like, now we're safe. And now we have about 1,000, and it's the same narrative. We need more. And I think part of what this moment requires of us is to reimagine what it is that drives crime, what it is that drives public safety, and how do we begin to connect people to things like wealth and prosperity. And that really is the province of the task force. Now, in my mind, along with that, there's certainly a question about investing in communities. I mean, one rational way, straightforward way is around internet. How is it that whole cities don't have internet, right? It puts it on the family, the least able to get things like that. But some of this is public policy, some of this is reparations. I think that's part of why this task force is so essential. I'll pause.
No, that's beautiful. I think maybe we'll invite folks to speak into the mic so we can hear your voice, and then pass it back and forth. Who's got another question?
I'll ask another one, but without the mic. I'll speak loudly. So my second follow-up question to Ryan is, we have talked about this before, and this has been an ongoing conversation for many years. So if we form this task force, what is the timeline do we have to enact and act?
Yeah, wonderful question. So you all heard the question about, so this is not a new conversation. And when the task force is finally created, what's the timeline? So the way the legislation is written, the task force will be created. It will include representatives from academia, from certain other disciplines. It will include practitioners, organizational heads, and then legislators get to choose folks who will serve on it as well. The way it's written is it'll meet for 2 years. It'll release preliminary findings in year 1. It will hold hearings, 6 hearings across the state to hear from folks. And at the end of the 2 years, it'll release a report that sort of organizes those 2 ways, the history of slavery in New Jersey, and then, as importantly, the policy recommendations and the other investments that are recommended to respond to the first part. I'll say this, so it's one practical question that flows from your question is, well, Ryan, this is not a new conversation. So I mentioned to you, I started work 20 years ago at a law firm. At that time, one of the firm's clients was Lloyd's of London, right, the big time insurance company. And a solo practitioner sued Lloyd's of London because Lloyd's of London had insured against the loss of slave ships and enslaved people. And it was amazing. So, again, a solo practitioner suing Lloyd's of London, and the court dismissed her case on the doctrine, it's called laches, which means that she waited too long to bring the case, right? That she should have brought it sooner, closer to the time that there was the harm. And you all are laughing because it gets to your question. When could she have brought the case? 20 years later, we're having literally 20 years later, and she was seeking reparations right away. Like she was like seeking financial compensation. 20 years later, we're asking for an official way to have a conversation. Official meaning that New Jersey, Pastor Howard in the 80s was working against apartheid in South Africa, trying to get New Jersey to divest from South Africa. Decades later, we're having a conversation about a task force. And here's the thing, like, I think this is the opportunity, because 2 years ago, pre-George Floyd, pre-COVID-19, when we started talking about this, you all, honestly, there was zero traction. Pastor Howard will tell you, we were like, we're gonna try to push for reparations, and there was zero interest. The world has moved like so decidedly ahead on, like now people like say Black Lives Matter. You'll remember Black Lives Matter was like a curse word, right? Saying things like structural racism, like who was doing that? Now though, the challenge is people are saying those words, but are we willing to do the work under those words to make those words really matter? And that's why I think the Reparations Task Force is so essential to meet this moment.
Another question at the front. And if you could just say your name and where you live, that would be really great, so we know who's here.
Hi, my name's Surya and I'm from Princeton. So I was thinking about how reparations is inherently a restorative justice issue, right? So where do you foresee like programs such as the Restorative Justice Hub's pilot program and perhaps alternative court systems such as like mental health courts coming into this discussion?
I love so, are you a student?
Yes.
Yeah.
High school student.
High school student from Princeton right here. So she just asked, she was the snaps in a circle. She just, so one of the things we worked on, I mentioned to you this extraordinary investment we make in youth incarceration. And one of our big pushes was for New Jersey to close. We have a youth prison system that can hold about 550 young people. And we have less than 150 young people in prison. But we staff those prisons as if they're at capacity with adults, which is why we spend $600,000 to incarcerate each kid. When you go into these youth prisons, and there are adults who work very, very hard. I'm not diminishing what they do in these youth prisons, but you can go into these youth prisons, you'll find adults in wings that are entirely empty. There are no kids because the population is so small. So our push has been that New Jersey should close its 3 youth prisons. You could move those kids to smaller facilities that are not prison-like, though still secure, and you could reinvest a tremendous amount of what we now spend incarcerating young people in those communities most impacted by youth incarceration. There's one youth prison, I know folks are familiar with this, it's called Hayes, it's the girls' youth prison in Bordentown, New Jersey. It's on the campus of what was the Bordentown School for Colored Youth. This was New Jersey's Tuskegee of the North. It was an elite black boarding school that attracted luminaries who came to speak like Mary McLeod Bethune, W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson. It was a place where black kids got an elite education. And right after the Brown decision, New Jersey closed it. And today, the site of what was an elite publicly run black boarding school is home to a girls' youth prison. And across the street is a medium secure youth prison for boys. And so that is literally school to prison pipeline realized. It was an elite school, today it's a prison. And that speaks to the kinds of investments that we make. So we had a pilot program, to the Genius High School students' point here, that sought to reinvest about 15% of New Jersey's youth incarceration budget into 4 cities most impacted by youth incarceration as part of a restorative justice pilot program. The thinking is that these pilots would provide young people services they need ahead of getting entangled with the criminal justice system and on the back end when they come home. And that bill, it did pass. And those pilot programs are now being stood up in the 4 cities. And I honestly, part of what I think this conversation requires is how do we make deeper investments in communities, and empowering communities, and not harming them with our finances.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jasmine. I live here in Lawrence. And my question is about if you have any sources of inspiration from other governments, either in the US or internationally, that we could look to for examples.
On this, Olivia, Jasmine? Is your name? Yeah. So did you hear Jasmine asked if there are other sources of inspiration, other states or governments that we can look to for progress on this? So on the opportunity side, before last year, no state in the country had created a reparations commission or task force. So we had legislation introduced, as I shared, and then our dear friends from California saw I think, what happened in my mind, they saw Jasmine, they saw our legislation, so impressed by it that they introduced a version of it in their state legislature. It was championed by their now Secretary of State. She was in their state legislature. She was a real champion for it. And the governor signed it. And so California, inspired by us in New Jersey, introduced and got passed a California Reparations Task Force or Commission. And they've had 2 meetings. So the reason I lift that up is because they're the first to do it. I believe we'll be the second to do it. On the federal level, there's a bill called H.R. 40. It was introduced by the late John Conyers, I think 35 years ago. It finally, on the opportunity side, it finally got a hearing on the House side in 2019. So there is you are starting to see movement on these, but in terms of inspiration on this, I think the inspiration is that we're finally having a conversation in spaces like these, and you do start to see the legislation moving. And another opportunity is as we push for the state task force, is as you all did with the draft resolution, for cities to begin to have conversations about how slavery happened in their localities, in their cities, in their municipalities, to help inform what will happen when the state task force is finally created. But I don't want to suggest, that we, to the earlier question, that we create a task force and then we throw our hands up like it's Juneteenth, right? I think the reason I'm encouraged by this is because I imagine that once the task force does its work and we hold the task force accountable to advancing real recommendations, real investments, real policies, that becomes a blueprint for someone who's now a high school or college student who becomes a lawyer or a politician or a key thought leader, that they don't have to start from zero in having these conversations about the way forward. I think that's the real power of this task force, that it provides for us a blueprint that answers those questions. So how do you actually repair harm, and what does that look like?
I'm looking to our organizers. We're a little bit over, so how many more questions should we take?
Let's just take these 3 for
Yep, perfect, okay.
Fine. My name is Steve, and I live here in Lawrenceville. This is not a question, but since this came up, I've been in contact with our new congressional representative for this Lawrence district, Representative Andy Kim, and he has a statement in support of H.R. 40, the national bill. So I can have copies if anyone would like to. There's 20 copies here. It's very eloquent, and he mentions that that bill, as well as a national House resolution which calls for the establishment of a United States Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, which is also in the House.
Thank you so much, and we'll put these on the table right there. Who's our next?
Thank you, Kelly. My name is Ted. I live here in Lawrence. On the one hand, I'm a huge supporter of this legislation. I have been for years. I want to motivate what I will call the progressive base to get active. hooray, hooray. But let me ask you a question about the other hand. You gave us a moving story about talking to an audience that included a man you identified as white. I expect he identifies himself as white. And he was, no, I think we need to allow each person to identify themselves. So I don't want to call anybody whatever ethnic characteristic I think they have. Anyway, he was not as wealthy as the average white guy in New Jersey, from his own testimony. And he believed all of these shibboleths and all of these lies. Black people are lazy and this and that and the next thing. My question to you, Ryan, is how do we sit down and have a real conversation with folks like that?
That's such a great question.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question. Obviously, you're also a lawyer by training, since you mentioned testimony. So I love the question. One is, and I should have carried that story through to the end because, those early questions weren't necessarily questions he asked in good faith, but after we had a pretty robust conversation, which included questions from him that were in good faith. And so I think to the extent that people are willing to have conversations in good faith, we should have them. And I'll say this to you, my mom, so I'm half white. My mother's white, father's black, obviously. I don't often get the benefit of being half white, right? Although I identify as black, but my biological mother is white. And here's why that matters, because, and the Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. But after Donald Trump won the White House, my mom called me. And she won't mind me sharing this story because I have in the past. Tears. She said, Ryan, oh my gosh, how could this happen? And then she said, we gotta get more black women, more black people, more people of color. They gotta show up in bigger numbers next time. You know where I'm going with this, right? And I said, Mom, if you look at the numbers, there was near unanimous support from black and brown people for another candidate. And this other candidate still won. And that's because the majority of white men and women voted for that candidate. So Mom, there are conversations that white people have to have in spaces where black and brown folks don't have access. And I'll say to you, I love you the question, because for me as a black person, I get this work, I'm here tonight, this is work that feeds my soul. When Pastor Howard told me I could be here, although I have a beautiful wife and 2 teenage boys, I wanted to be here, maybe because I have 2 teenage boys. But, so I love this work. This is work, I feel so blessed by God to be able to do this. 20 years, there's never been a day where I thought, oh my gosh, I gotta go to work. This is what I love. But one of the painful realities of being a civil rights lawyer is the realization that you can craft the very best arguments from a data-driven perspective, undeniable numbers. You could tell a story, you can point to real people, but if it's black people you're talking about, and here specific to black people, it's not enough to marshal all the facts to get every black elected in the legislature to support a bill as they do here, to get plenty of black support. If you had unanimous support of each of the 1 million black people in New Jersey, and you had every black elected support a bill as we do in the bill, it's not enough. It hasn't moved because the coalition that we have built is not big enough. And this bill, this is specifically to my mom and other white allies, this bill will only move and only get passed when our white allies move themselves to places that are very uncomfortable, to have conversations in spaces we as people of color will never be, to say things that we'll never have a chance to say. And I've seen it. When I interacted with that man, part of him was challenged because he was like, it sounds like this dude knows what he's talking about, but I don't know if I believe it. And then he found a place that was comfortable for him aside from the facts, there was his own personal experience. But I've seen some of our communications director is a woman, Lori Beecham, who's a Jewish woman, very well versed. I've seen her give a version of this presentation. It's received very, very differently, right? We are all shaped by race and by racism, just by virtue of the foundation we stand on. So in my mind, concretely, this bill moves when people who are in Craig Coughlin's circle, when people who are in Nick Scutari, Senate President Nick Scutari's circle, when people who know Governor Murphy. The day before our Juneteenth rally last year, we had been urging Governor Murphy to create this task force through executive order. He could do it. In the same way that people are urging President Biden to create through executive order the commission on the federal level. He could do it. The night before our rally, Governor Murphy created a wealth gap task force. Right? The night before our rally to advocate for a reparations task force, Governor Murphy created a wealth gap task force. And he identified as one of the co-conveners, Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, who the following day said, we gotta talk about reparations, right? And so I think what is required of this effort, as has always been required of this effort, is for white allies to put themselves in uncomfortable spaces along with people of color to move the issue forward in spaces where we can't necessarily be. And that in the same conversation I have with my mom is the one I have with white allies across the state, that this moment calls for that. You know, it's very uncomfortable for people of color to be people of color. It just is. We often don't get to talk about how it's very uncomfortable. It's beautiful, but it's also equal parts worrisome and uncomfortable. And what we need is white allies to join us in those spaces of discomfort. My mom's response that we should do more, she later was like, yeah, I think you're right. Like, maybe I can have those kinds of conversations that you can't have, Ryan. Absolutely. And I would say the same for my white allies in this room.
We're going to take one more question from this young person right here. One of you beautiful young people. And then Patricia Farmer, Hendricks Farmer is going to lead us into the future. I'm going to try.
Hi, I'm Bernice. I go to Ryder. I do live here. I live on Ryder's campus, but I'm not from here. I guess my question is, like, because I'm 19, sometimes I feel useless in these types of conversations or like movements. So I wanted to what the younger generations can do to support the movement in any way we can.
Was it Bernice? Yes. What year at Ryder?
I'm a sophomore.
Okay. 2024, and then the gentleman next to you, what year are you, Ryder?
Sophomore 2024.
Okay, both. And what's your name?
I'm Trey.
Bernice and Trey. All right, so Bernice asked a question at 19, you know, what can students do? So I love this question for like 1,000 reasons, but the primary reason is because you don't know this now, Bernice, at 19, but like in college is when you're probably most courageous and least entangled. And by that I mean, like right now, you know you can change the world. And you're not really worried about the consequences of taking positions. And something happens. It won't happen to you or Trey. But sometimes adulthood, it's almost like on your camera when you could take like that panoramic photograph, like that's college. Like you're like, I could do it all. But then something happens.
A liberal is a radical with 2 children and a mortgage.
There it is. So Pastor Howard's point, then something happens. You graduate and then you get a job and bills and mortgages and that panoramic photo where you were like, I could change the world is now like, well, you know, maybe I can maybe I can have like a shorter, like just a photo, like a portrait, right? And you get constrained and you do become more worried, more fearful, more conservative. You start worrying more about like, if I do this thing, what will that mean? In college, And that's why I think young people have always been at the heart of all social movements. All of them. There would be no social movements without, if it was up to adults, 40 and up, we were like, so what time is it? I'm tired. It's all, like, young folks have always inspired social movements. So we have on Friday, this is the Juneteenth again, June 17th is the day that we'll celebrate Juneteenth. I'll give you my information. We're gonna have another of those rallies. So I would love to support students from Ryder coming to that. It'll be a powerful day where we're encouraging our legislators to move this bill, to have a hearing. And here's the thing, I love to stay in contact. We've worked with young people to testify in support of legislation. And that is when legislators see young people showing up on issues, they take notice in ways they don't when old heads come. So let's talk about how to get you engaged. But your voice is absolutely necessary to this and all social justice work.
Thank you, Ryan.
Did you sign up? Over there?
Yeah. I was also going to say, while you're at Ryder, you are part of Lawrence. Well, I just wanted to thank you again for sharing with us so much great information. And I'm going to just talk about a few next steps. And one of the things being, we encourage everyone to pick up materials that were brought and not to leave those. And also just a couple of dates. Please attend with us the Lawrence Township Council meeting Tuesday, May 17th at 6:30 p.m. And also attend the new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee meeting on May 19th at 6:30 p.m. The other things is to please scan the code or leave your email so that we can still get into communication with everyone who wants more information. And most importantly, we just want to thank you for being part of the conversation. And if you have any more questions, we're more than happy to stick around for a few more minutes and ask those questions. So thank you, thank you, thank you. One more thing.
This was not on the agenda, but I would like to tell folks, since we have a good crowd here, Lawrence Township has been ahead of all the other municipalities in the county in moving forward. And that's because of people like you who are here tonight. There's no place else in the county that is having meetings like this. So even though we're talking about, we're still where we were in the 1960s, there's a lot of things that have happened here in Lawrence to help the community, the Black community, that has not been done anywhere else in this county, probably in the state. So we've been fortunate to have people who have been fighting, just like you guys are here tonight. So let's keep this up. Let's keep it up. Let's not back down.